Welcome back. I'm Max Bergmann, Director of the Stewart Center and Europe, Russia, Eurasia Program at CSIS.
And I'm Maria Snegovaya, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia.
And you're listening to Russian Roulette, a podcast discussing all things Russia and Eurasia from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Russian Roulette. I'm your host, Max Bergmann, and here with my co-host, as always, Maria Snegovaya. Before we begin, loyal listeners will know that we at Russian Roulette truly appreciate your feedback. If you have feedback or ideas, you can send in ideas for future episodes at erep@csis.org or find us on social media. We want to hear your thoughts. Let us know how we can make things better or give us your ideas for what topics you want to cover. For today's show, we are thrilled to welcome back Dr. Jade McGlynn. Jade is a scholar of Eastern European and Russian studies and has conducted research on the region at universities across the United States, Russia, and England. She taught at Oxford before joining the Department of War Studies at King's College, where she now works as a senior research fellow within their Center for Statecraft and National Security. Her first book, Russia's War, was published in 2023 and is about Russia's domestic political approval for the invasion of Ukraine. And her second book, Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia, came out later that same year. She was very busy in 2022 and 2023. And now she's also a non-resident senior associate here at CSIS, where she has published reports on the resistance efforts in occupied Ukraine and the ideology surrounding Putin's rule of Russia. Jade, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
So maybe we'll start with a piece that you co-wrote with my co-host, Maria Snegovaya, about Putin's standing, about Russian public opinion, and signs that it may be shifting. Maybe you could start by outlining what's your core argument? What do you think is happening? Are things changing, or is everything still the same?
I think the argument that we're making, and I'm sure Maria will correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are shifts in terms of course, there's always a shift whenever there's some sort of shock, and the fuel strikes. 196 different sites were attacked across 2026. Of course, that functions as such a shock, but that whilst it can add to the general war wariness among let's say quite a significant swathe of the population, Russian public opinion is not a monolith. It's going to spark different reactions in different types of people, and that ultimately Russian public opinion functions a bit more as an output rather than a lever. So we probably shouldn't be looking at it as something that, okay, well, people are going to be... I think it's quite a jump to suggest there have been fuel strikes. People are annoyed about being accused. That's fine. Therefore, they are going to turn against the war in a really kind of, in a way that's actually much more coherent from a Western viewpoint than from a Russian viewpoint. They're going to really turn against the war, and then they're going to do something about it, and that's going to have an impact. I think it starts off on very steady ground and then it ends up on very shaky ground is the argument that we're trying to make, that it's not going to work like that. Though Maria, you have to forgive me if I've managed to kind of mis-summarize our piece.
No, absolutely. And Jade strikes me as one of the most nuanced thinkers, when it comes to really understanding the Russian public opinion, its shifts. The key takeaway is that and I stand by my argument, which some of the liberal communities challenge, that Russians in general do rally around this war. They support the war. Nonetheless, as Jade flagged, there are two broadly understood groups within this support. It's heterogeneous support. There's hawks. They are more ideological. They constitute slower share of the supporters, and they tend to rally around the flag in response to strikes, calling for stronger action. From their perspective, Putin is too weak. He's not, strong enough in response to the West in Ukraine. And then there are the majority of so-called loyalists or moderates, whatever you want to call them, there's also the term swamp that some sociologists are using. They just follow whatever Putin does, and if Putin stops the war, they'll support it. And as long as Putin wants the war, they're sort of fine with it, because from their perspective, they're just ordinary people, and he knows what he's doing, right? They're not foreign policy professionals. But the unique feature of the ongoing strikes is that for the loyalists, they're highly problematic, given that they impact the economic perceptions. And for the loyalists, the status quo and support for Putin and the status quo um, is sustained as long as economic things are fine. Economy is doing well. But because strikes in particular influence the economic well-being, reinforcing the negative trends accumulating in the Russian economy, this is the group that's more likely to withdraw support. And as we show in the article, that's exactly what's happening. We do see a decline in support, not just because of the strikes. In fact, there's accumulating factors, right? We've discussed a lot on this podcast how Russian economy is basically past its sugar high period that it experienced at the start of the war because of the state-induced investment in the economy. And it's already sort of stagnating. On top of that, Ukrainian strikes are reinforcing all of the negative trends. And as a result, all of the authorities' approvals are declining. The war support is declining even more. And even by Kremlin's own official Polstavtsiom, which, by the way, already changed the methodology once this year in order to sort of curdle the decline. Nonetheless, the decline has continued by its own data. And by July 12th, it actually fell to 65%, the lowest figure since the start of the full-scale support. I'm talking about Putin's approval rating here. So the Ukrainian strikes are making a difference. That's what we're saying.
Let me pick up on that for a second, Maria, and maybe Jade, back to you. How do you assess Russian public opinion, right? I mean, there's been a lot of debate about the veracity of polling inside of Russia, given if you were asked, if you called someone up and said, what do you think of Vladimir Putin? I think the answer might be shaded by the fear if you say something negative, then, you would be found out, and that's not, people want to keep that to themselves. So how are you, both of you, assessing Russian public opinion? Is it this polling? Is it just monitoring social media? How are you assessing it?
I think, unfortunately, because the debate is quite an emotional one, because it links into how people want to see their countries from which people are obviously displaced. Often the conversation is had in a rather simplistic way, and as always, I really like Maria's additions. I think that, of course, okay, can you trust polling? Well, can you trust polling anywhere? I mean, you should always be triangulating your data and not just looking at one point. And of course, if you're dealing with an authoritarian country, then you're going to want to, be even more careful. But I think with discipline, of course, you're looking at what is this instrument measuring. I mean, we've had preference falsification. We wrote about this. So moving on from sort of the preference falsification, I think there are also different tells. For example, certainly in the free polling efforts that I've kind of had engagement with, I can't see that since 2022 and that initial shock, the refusal or the don't know rates have especially spiked, or the interview lengths where those happen, there hasn't been a collapse. There are difficulties in terms of getting through, but they're technological difficulties imposed by the Kremlin rather than, from trying to speak to people themselves. And also, I think it's about, of course, if you're going to ask people a question like, do you support the special military operation? I'm not sure how helpful that necessarily is as a question, given the point that you were making. But there are other questions, how hopeful do you feel about the future? And there, again, as with any polling, you're not going to say, 59% of people definitely and definitively feel excited about the future. But what you're going to say is, that's really interesting. There's been a huge dip, and then it's come back again. What happened there? So it's the trends that it allows you to track, and then you can triangulate it against other types of data, whether that's statistics, whether that's, qualitative data, to sort of make sense of it. And I think that polling data is an important part of that triangulation. And also as well, part of me thinks, I spend a lot of time researching the occupied territories as well, which is, even harder. And, I wouldn't trust any polling actually from the occupied territories broadly, unless it was on very specific, when did you last receive water in your apartment block? But at some point, we have to just accept that our tools, our instruments, they are flawed. But as researchers, what's the other options? Just say, oh, well, we can't know, that's a black box. That doesn't seem, very satisfactory. It's much better to engage with the data we have, of course, recognize its limitations and its caveats, triangulate as much and as often as we can, and give it an honest and sincere go to try and work out what is happening and track it, always with humility, but also, with curiosity. We can't just say, oh, no, that doesn't work.
And maybe if I could just quickly jump in and add to that, in political science, for social scientists, discovering something as major as radically biased polls based on composition or based on sensitivity biases, right? People's responsiveness to polls, whatnot, it would be really fantastic finding, but really easily publishable. And it's all about publish or perish. And so there's a lot of scholars who have worked since 2022 trying to find major discrepancies between post 2022 and pre 2022 polls. And so far, there are no consistent findings, just as Jade flagged, on a variety of indicators, not necessarily only sensitivity bias, but sample composition and whatnot. On top of that, alternative measures, right? If Russians fundamentally are anti-war and they cannot speak up, then we should see maybe powerful anti-war movement emerging outside of Russia. That, however, also did not happen throughout almost 5 years of the war. At this point, in fact, we see that instead Kremlin is meeting many of the schools, including as Michael Kaufman flags in his recent War on the Rocks article, real unprecedented recruitment levels. Russia has been able to recruit enormous amount of people by post-Second World War standards in the last 4.5 years. And last but not least, historical patterns. It's not the first war Putin started, unfortunately. It's his fifth war. He's been in power over quarter century, and every single time the pattern is very similar. That is, unfortunately, Russians rally around the wars that he starts, and over the time this effect dissipates, and that's exactly what we've seen in 2022. So if we argue 2022 is different, then the burden of proof is on the opposite side. Yeah, they have to explain as to why they think the 2022 war was fundamentally different from every single war that Putin has started before it.
Now, it does seem that there are starting to be some cracks in Russian public opinion. Ukrainian strikes on Russia's oil refining infrastructure, leading to fuel shortages and high cost of fuel, and just sort of a general angst, I think, about the direction of travel, both in the conflict but also in the economy writ large. And also, you see Vladimir Putin doing things that I think he tends to do when he's perhaps not the most popular or somewhat concerned about his popularity. I think the FT had a great kicker to one of their stories when Putin went to a kid's judo class and he was kissing a young girl on the cheek, and someone said it's never a good sign when Putin is kissing a child on the cheek. For him, at least, meaning that he's having to sort of put himself out there to show that he's a man of the people, but and for the child,
Yeah.
yeah, so I would be a little terrified. But so is this having effect? Are we starting to see? Because Maria, I guess one challenge I would have to you is that this is now sort of a Russian consumer society that it's different than the Soviet period. And this is not a war that it seems that the Russian public is that excited about. Now they don't want their country to lose the war, but there also would be, I think, quite content if it ended, or at least that's what it seems. So I'm curious, are we seeing sort of is this war coming home at all? And then is that leading to a surge in support, rally around the flag, or, more anxiety? Jade.
I sort of think about this in terms of like a stamina axis, almost, in the sense that it's not about whether or not people kind of support, I suppose, the priors or assumptions or worldview that kind of made the war possible. It's about whether or not people are willing to make sacrifices for it. And I think, broadly, this is what we write about in the article as well, is that, people are kind of war wary in this sense of they don't want to have to make more sacrifices for it. I mean, that's perfectly legitimate, but it sort of also then comes, I guess, if you're talking about the effect, I mean, I guess depends what effect do you mean. I think that public opinion will not stop this war, but at the same point, that also means it wouldn't stand in the way of it stopping. So I suppose it depends, do you want to be glass half full? I mean, some of the more hardliners that we've written about, I think that's a different kettle of fish, or that's a different group, a different segmentation. But if we're talking about the kind of large, moderates, loyalists, war, whatever you want to call them, I don't think that they're going to, cause the war to stop. I also don't think that they would, provided that if, let's say, there were a ceasefire, I'm very skeptical there would be, but let's say there was a ceasefire tomorrow and everything just froze along the current lines, I don't think they're going to cause any problems about the fact that I think, in fact, many of them would feel quite relieved and would just want to kind of get on with their life, but with nothing of the kind of underlying worldview or interpretation of the world challenged, which means that those views could be mobilized again for future wars, in my reading. So I guess what we're talking about in some ways is more stamina rather than support. Are they growing tired within a kind of accommodation of the war and how much they're having to accommodate? Yes, I think we can see that, and we can see a draw on resources, including public goodwill for the war. Does that mean that it's swinging into opposition? I don't read it that way, though I'd be interested in Maria's view.
Well, I definitely echo Jade on the point about the importance of the public opinion, but I will flag that also important to keep in mind that Putin is not fighting this horrible, horrible war. That's one of the most atrocious, right? Like by far the most atrocious in Europe after Second World War, by himself. Right, there's a lot of people involved, those who are being recruited into the army, even if they're recruited through economic incentives, not necessarily ideological incentives. They're still going, right? They're still pushing on the front line. They're still killing Ukrainians, sending drones and missiles every night and whatnot. They're still working at the factories. And by the way, labor shortage, right? And the competition between civilian and military industry for labor is a huge, huge factor. So people who are more willing, who are more supportive of the war, right? They're more likely to go and get paid at factories. They're still circumventing sanctions, which is one major, engagement of much of the Russian private business at this private and state-connected business at this point. So all of that matters. And we, even if Putin may be driven by considerations other than the Russian public opinion, from Ukrainian perspective, having fewer willing participants in his endeavor would be really, really welcome. Also because it's unlikely that Putin is going to stop the war just because he realizes, he can't achieve these goals. From Ukrainian perspective, defensive actions alone would not gonna tilt this dynamic, and so inevitably they're gonna have to be switching to the offensive. That is bringing the war into Russia, right? They're developing their own missiles, they're intensifying the strikes on refineries. All of that is basically, from their perspective, the inevitable next step if the war were to end at some point. They just have to make the war really very difficult to endure for the majority of Russians. And as we see, the strikes are already somewhat starting to have that effect, go in that direction. They increase anxiety, war fatigue, demand for the peace, and decrease war approval. I will also flag that the drone strikes in particular are very well noticed by Russians. And I'm not just talking about the gasoline lines in Russia, but also the fact that the Ukrainian strikes have been named as number one most notable event in May and June, and most likely will be also in July. That is, for Russians, this is the biggest news of the month.
So I guess the crux of the question from a policymaking perspective, or from, I guess, the Ukrainian government's perspective, is does Putin have sort of total freedom of movement here? Is public opinion constraining him? And you can put it in two ways. One, is there concern for Putin about public opinion turning against the war, so that therefore it's going to sort of push him to want to, make concessions, negotiate something, and you could tie that together with the battlefield not going his way. So you could say, okay, public opinion is running against him, so he needs to make concessions and make this war go away. Or the alternative, and you guys outline this as well, that, well, there's now a group of hardliners that are demanding success and progress. So if he were to, hit the pause or stop button with a ceasefire, that could give him internal problems. So I guess, how do you see that from the right, and then maybe, I don't want to call it the left, but sort of an anti-war And is there any sort of public opinion pressure on him, or does Putin have this kind of freedom of movement where he can sort of manipulate it and he can sort of go whatever course he wants to in the war? So is public opinion an important factor in what and how you think the Kremlin is processing the war right now? And Jade, over to you.
I don't think that public opinion functions inside Russia and probably other countries, other authoritarian countries, in the same way that we are used to talking about public opinion in democratic countries. But at the same point, I also don't think it's just a case that the Kremlin doesn't care. We know, they put in considerable effort to polling and to controlling things, like Vitsium, and the director of Vitsium did not amend the trust rating methodology because he had a problem with the methodology. It was a political issue. I imagine. I don't want to be too unfair. But we know that they track this. Sometimes we even get leaked versions of the polling, or Medusa and others do. So it's definitely a factor within their decision making, or the way that they frame decision making. If we think about the last leak polling, or at least the last leak polling I'm aware of that came out at the end of last year, and you saw this kind of division of Russian society into two groups. Those who want a great Russia. It's not my division. It was sort of from the Kremlin, but those who want a great Russia, those who want a comfortable life. And so they obviously are kind of tracking things. I don't think they live completely in cloud cuckoo land. And I think the fact that there's this real reticence to have a second wave of mobilization, that's pretty clear, because any polling, doesn't matter which type of polling you look at, is very, very adamant. The one thing the Russian public opinion is very, very clear on, well, there are many things, but it's especially clear on, they do not have any appetite for a second wave of mobilization. And if we do have, Maria was kind of talking about how you have this kind of draw on resources, and having the war coming home, does it dampen, the available manpower that Russia might have to call upon, in terms of giving people money so they sign up to Ukraine? And I mean, there's some really interesting interplays there that become quite complex, because if that's happening and he's losing public opinion, or people are becoming more war wary, less willing to kind of accommodate sacrifices, and in certain groups less willing to sign up. So you have a complex interplay, really, between a need to perhaps mobilize, but also with perhaps dampening support. However, we also need to think about, if there is continuing economic pressure, that's also going to widen the pool of people who may end up attracted to sign up to these contracts, which are incredible. I mean, I was looking at some of the mobilization posters that are in Mariupol at the moment. There were some pictures from June 2026, and the figures being offered there compared to like the average salary in Mariupol, which is about kind of 40,000 rubles, or like $400 a month. They're just astronomical. It's sort of like 3 million rubles. And that's just the sign-up bonus. And of course, Mariupol's a very complicated case. It's just because they're the ones I have the most recent photos of. And of course, it's not Russia. It's Ukraine and occupied by Russians. But it's just a symbol that this is still going on, and they are still able to offer quite a lot of money. So I think that drawing down of resources, but at some point it's going to come to crunch elements. And is that crunch element in itself going to be public opinion? No, but I think it's going to be the constraints of which public opinion will add to one, to the options available.
Well, I completely agree with everything that Jade said. We just have to look at what the Kremlin thinks about this. And just as Jade, you flagged, all of this effort to quote unquote normalize the war, make sure that Russians not looking there, look in the other direction, nothing to see here, just a special military operation, using avoidance of the use of conscripts, the switch to this so-called volunteer army, and very intensive indoctrination of the society. They all speak of the importance that the Kremlin assigns to the role of the Kremlin society, at least in enabling the war. I also have a forthcoming book on related topics, and I think that the Kremlin continues to think of the war, any war, in somewhat Stalinist terms, in which stability of the home front, so to speak, is absolutely crucial. So if you want to have a successful war, you absolutely need to have your society under control. And that's why, by the way, if you look at what happened before 2022, it was a very targeted repression against all the leftover NGOs and political groups, precisely to enable the stability of the war front. And the second point I will make is that hawks, so-called hawkish groups, they're themselves divided about whether the war should be continuing or not. So we know that the moderates and loyalists are tilting towards stopping this war, right? They're exhausted, the economic strain really begins to show. But in the hawkish groups, there's no alignment. Indeed, Max, as you said, one part of that does basically lobby for the nuclear option, God forbid, and whatnot. They want Putin tougher, invade all of Europe, go to take Berlin and whatnot. But there's another group that actually believes that Putin is highly unsuccessful, that he's doing everything wrong, sort of Prigozhin style, so to speak. And they actually also start thinking that the war needs to stop. Unfortunately, in this case, in order to reconstitute, rebuild, and do it again, but this time the right way. But I just want to flag that even within the hawkish groups, there is a significant share that supports stopping the war.
Maybe to shift gears a little bit, I want to bring up The Economist had a cover story that was quite controversial with a Russian oligarch, Andrei Melenchenko, where it caused a lot of waves. And maybe Jade, maybe I could ask for your thoughts on the article. How would you characterize it? What do you think that sort of represents?
It's funny because I've actually deliberately avoided commenting on it, a bit like with Masha and the Bear, where I'm just like, everybody's had an opinion. I just know. But since you've specifically asked me, I found, for me personally, I found the interview, there were certain aspects that I found interesting about it. I think clearly he's not, I don't think that it's correct. It's obviously not correct to read him as kind of, a critic, or I don't believe it's, correct to read what he's saying as criticism of the Kremlin, nor do I think it's just like complete parroting. What I sort of see it was is almost evidence of something a bit more worrying than either, because he seems to be asking for some sort of settlement in which Russia's interests are respected, which we kind of know what that means, unfortunately. I don't think it is Russia's interest. I think it means what the Russian state sees as its interest to sort of interfere in and control its neighbors and have a sort of veto over the European security architecture. And I think it's interesting as well to see what sanctions did to him. They didn't teach that the war was a mistake. From my understanding, his wealth has not been especially impacted by the war. But obviously, perhaps I thought he was living in the UAE for some considerable time before moving back to Moscow after war managed to catch up with him out in the Gulf. But he makes the argument, if we take him his word, he makes the argument that the sanctions taught him that he had to stand with his country, and this is quite common actually. I was reading through some research, some qualitative interviews, quite common, this sense of, well, the West has sort of rejected all of us. The West wants us to be, like this awful other, these awful barbarians. Fine, well, let's just be it then. And this kind of sense of grievance. And I think that reading it, he's not really arguing against the war, and he is arguing for a belief system that, in my view, made the war available. I think it is I would interpret it, though I'm not, a specialist on the elites, as a kind of outreach or a messaging that certainly I would find it very shocking if it wasn't done without some kind of nods from the Kremlin. But that doesn't mean he's parroting the Kremlin line. There's shades of grey within things. And I don't think the question is really, is Melnichenko sincere? I actually think it's worth engaging with what he says, because it shows us that there are a number of kind of problems that exist within different groups that I think also speak to a kind of strategic dilemma from a European perspective of, well, how do we engage with that, or how do we, in my view, contain that? Because there is a certain view of the world that even if somebody is not committed to the total destruction of Ukraine, as Putin appears to be, it's still going to be very difficult, especially after all of the atrocity that's happened, to come to some sort of accommodation with these views, even when they're made, I'm sure very eloquently and very articulately by an intelligent and very rich person.
To me, I would also add to everything that Jade said. We've been, there was some discussion about whether oligarchs are, correctly sanctioned at the start of the war. After all, as the argument went, these are possible, like independent businesses that, according to democratization theory, are gonna eventually take over Putin and build a new, beautiful Russia of the future. And I think Malenchenko's interview is very important in that sense that it completely refutes that evidence, right? This is, in terms of our early conversation, a moderate loyalists article that parrots. This is where I actually don't fully agree with Jade. I think it parrots nicely Kremlin's points. So I think it's really almost verbatim reproduces the Kremlin's talking points, especially in this so-called op-ed part. Just to give you some numbers from the Bell interview, sovereignty is absolutely crucial for Putin, and Putin has since 2022 mentioned sovereignty more often than words like medicine, science, or budget. Melnichenko mentioned sovereignty 31 times in this written piece. I'm sure that Russian oligarchs completely obsessed. That's all they think about is Russian sovereignty. It's the first time I've ever heard any one of them mentioning this word. But I want to flag that basically his argument, right, demonstrate that fundamentally he is part of the Kremlin support. Everything he's saying is repeating almost verbatim Putin's talking points, and the conclusion is very Putinist. Like the West has to come to its senses. It has treated us, the poor Russian oligarchs, and Putin and the Kremlin unfairly, and things can only be resettled and reset once the things are adjusted on the side of the West. All of that just demonstrate that basically oligarchs in a lot of ways act exactly the way the loyalists and moderates act of the broader society that we've discussed. That is, they fall in line with whatever the Kremlin does, as long as the status quo is satisfying for them, right? And as long as Kremlin allowed these people to make a lot of money, right, to like basically live their comfortable lives, they're happy with it, and they're not going to change much. And that is why the sanctions are completely right, because essentially they are reducing the influence of these groups in the West. They're fundamentally reducing the Kremlin influence in the West. But I'm not fully sure why The Economist, such a notable, influential platform, allows this basically Kremlin talking points to be promoted to wider Western audiences 4.5 years into this war.
Maria, sorry.
Go ahead.
I should
No,
say,
go ahead, Jade.
I agree with the final point. I found it interesting, as somebody who's kind of interested in reading Russian views about things, or at least how these views are presented. But I was kind of confused why I was reading it in The Economist. There are plenty of sites I can go to read these views. And I agree with you. I'm not really sure what the editorial decision behind that was, because we can quibble around the point of parroting, and perhaps your point is more accurate than mine. I think what I was trying to say is I don't think he didn't just go and he wasn't like sent with a gun to his head to sort of deliver certain talking points. But yes, I mean, it completely aligns with Kremlin, the sort of argument that the Kremlin would want out. Of course, the Kremlin always has an array of arguments rather than just kind of one set framing. And I really don't understand, in general, I don't like to criticize, but I just don't understand what purpose this served. I don't really see that it enriched our understanding of very much, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think the title, the headline was "The Man Who Would Change Russia," and it's quite suggestive that this is the guy that is going to somehow kind of do something. And then you read it and you're like, okay, well, as you both have outlined. And so I think it was just interesting, the editorial judgment to elevate this as if it was this huge deal. And if anything, my interpretation is a bit that maybe the sanctions actually did work, because they're clearly annoyed by them, right? They're clearly like, this is like, these suck and we really want to get out of, from being sanctioned. And that was sort of the point, was to take the people that were tools of the Kremlin, that were operating in Jade, City of London, and in Miami and other places, and say, get out. And it I think has been effective. And so I don't know. It was just an interesting editorial choice. I would say my broader interpretation is it does reflect, I do think, probably a simmering debate underneath about we need to figure out a slightly different path. And I think it does represent perhaps that there is some churn underneath the surface in different forces sort of pushing against each other about what direction to take a war that is not going well. But maybe that's my, an eternally American optimistic
Some
approach
Russian
that Maria just
fatalism there.
instantly rejects.
Destroy
But
US American friendship.
yeah, no, it's a whole bit. Um, maybe to shift gears to Ukraine. Uh, the war looks like it's going increasingly well for Ukraine. But there's just been this huge shakeup, Jade, where the Minister of Defense, Fedorov, has been let go. It's all in the press. Syrskyi, the commanding general, basically was like, it's him or me. I think the country and most of the Western publics and governments would have said, well, Zelensky made the wrong choice here. And there's protests in the streets of Ukraine. It's sort of the biggest protest since Zelensky tried to move against the anti-corruption bureau and officials about a year ago. Jade, I'm curious how you're in Ukraine all the time. You're a keen watcher of all things Ukraine. How do you interpret this?
I think it's somewhat bigger than a Fedorov versus Syrskyi, though. I do appreciate that Fedorov has tried to make it that way, and given some of Syrskyi's unpopularity among like the troops and among the general public, I would probably try and make it that way too if I were him. But he also said a wise point yesterday at his quite explosive sort of like press conference or whatever you want to call it, long interview that he gave. Fedorov said, I don't think that the people are protesting there for Minister Fedorov. And I think he's right in that sense. Yes, Fedorov is very popular. People like him, and cards on the table, I'm going to try and present like a more balanced or somewhat less hysterical than some of the Western media kind of view have given. But cards on the table, I also much prefer Fedorov's approach methods. I think that the ultimate question has to be, a question that he himself has posed, who is doing the things or enabling the things that allow soldiers on the front to do their missions more effectively and better and quicker. And that was, in my view, and in the view of the soldiers that I speak to, of course, it's not representative. There's an anecdotalism, of course, to it. But it was unanimously, positive about Fedorov and unanimously less positive about Syrskyi. That doesn't mean it's a fact. It's just, you deal with kind of the evidence you have. But I think it's also a kind of a protest around systems, because what you have, it wasn't just when the prime minister, when the government is dissolved, then it's not just Fedorov who's removed all of the ministers, according to kind of the Ukrainian constitution. Like then there are no ministers anymore, and you have to reappoint. And it wasn't only Fedorov, he wasn't the only change. Some people didn't like the fact that he was due to be replaced by Klimenko. It seems like Zelensky listened to the protests and did not make that change. Klimenko is seen in some parts of society as quite Soviet, but on the other hand, he also has support, from Azov and Hatia and some of these kind of more well-known, seen as more modern brigades or corps now, sorry. So it's never black and white in Ukraine. There's always like 7 million shades of grey. But to come to the kind of broader point, I think what people are upset about, certainly in my conversations with them, seems to be this sense of the old system, a system that they associate with a certain generation, with a Soviet way of doing things, the pretty horrific revelations about the Skelia and some of Syrskyi's so-called pet brigades, and the treatment of Ukrainian soldiers there, which has been akin to, some of the horrible stories we've read about, Russian treatment of some of their soldiers. It's had a huge public resonance, quite rightly, because you can't be treating human beings like that, let alone, soldiers who are defending your country. And that is then pitted against, this sense of this closed insider group who are there because they protect the network's interests. And yes, sometimes the network's interests intersect with the interests of the state, but not always. Versus somebody like Fedorov, who, is of course not perfect and not an angel, nobody is, but who is trying to kind of digitalize and bring transparency, especially to areas that have been blighted by accusations of corruption, such as military procurement. And I think what people felt sad about was this sense that that old insider system was winning over Fedorov's more transparent, more effective, or at least trying to be more effective system that they viewed as placing the state's interest and the interest of the war, or winning the war or not losing the war, above the interest of the network. And I mean, seeing yesterday, I know that a lot of the anger yesterday was also coming from people who were upset, the allies of Oleg Tatarov, who's a famous or infamous, well-known, there we go, we'll keep it neutral, well-known deputy head of the presidential administration, who was also, in the Interior Ministry during the Revolution of Dignity under Yanukovych. And, there's a lot of people who have questions about maybe why he's still so powerful and has so much power over kind of law and policing, and why some of his close allies are indeed kind of being promoted during this recent reshuffle. And that's obviously not the type of Ukraine that they are hoping for. And we've seen that on the streets.
So why do you think Zelensky went in this direction? Do you think this represents sort of a broader shift in strategy? Is it sort of, there's too much, if I was going to take a step back, it does seem someone pushing for radical bureaucratic change versus someone that is sort of wants to keep things going the way they were. And I think there's always a case for radical bureaucratic change, probably, but I could see anywhere. But on the other hand, sometimes it can be too much, too fast. There's a war going on. General on the ground, different than a minister, probably easier to change a minister to some degree. I guess, does this does this sort of send a signal about where Ukraine is headed? Because everyone was feeling quite positive about where the war effort was going. How do you see this now playing out looking ahead?
Yeah, again, I think I would probably take a step back from some of the more, and I know that you're not saying this is your interpretation, you're asking questions, but there have been some more dramatic interpretations there, as if this is close to apocalyptical. And bluntly, I mean, a lot of the changes that are associated, and I have no problem with them being associated with, or it doesn't matter if I have a problem, I don't think it's incorrect to associate them with Fedorov, because he very much enabled them. But, things like the strategic decision to shift, towards the middle strikes on command and control in the occupied territories, those shifts were already happening, and in some cases decisions were already taken before Fedorov. He also did a number of really wonderful things, some of which involved him personally. We know about the Starlink cutoff, and he made some good things that were already happening. He really enabled them and put the weight of the Ministry of Defense behind them, and sometimes it's money, which is, what some people in general staff got annoyed about, allegedly. So, there were already positive things. The good thing about Fedorov is often if I just speak sort of from a personal perspective of what I see, say when I go out east or when I'm spending time with soldiers who obviously different units, I'm going to keep anonymous, but sort of a range of them, they're often doing really incredible things, just like really incredible, really intelligent and very strategic. They could be strategically very useful, but there's very often a huge lack of strategic thinking, particularly since 2024, because some very talented people left the government or were asked to leave the government. And I think what Fedorov did is he not only was aware of all of those really clever things that different corps and different soldiers were doing almost organically and horizontally, he then enabled them and set up the government to help them. And I think what people are worried about is that those things will now collapse. It will go back to this need to constantly kind of feel like you're battling the state rather than being enabled by the state to fight Russia. And I think that would be a real shame, because even just in those 6 months, you did feel this sense of enthusiasm. And not all soldiers are unanimously for Fedorov and all are unanimously against Syrskyi. I should be clear about that. But in my experience, the ones I speak to, they are pretty much, not for Syrskyi at the very least. And I think that's the impact that it might have on morale. There was a sense that things that were and are real problems could change. And I worry that hope will disappear. I think that's the more kind of decisive factor, rather than, I don't think it signals any strategic thinking or a strategic decision on Zelensky's part. In fact, I just don't think there's a lot of strategic thinking going on in general. And that was one of the things that one of the opportunities Fedorov presented that now may be lost.
Maybe I'll just add a quick comment, Max. I remember when we were in Ukraine a couple of months ago. One of the officials we met with compared Ukraine to a marathon runner under missile strikes who simultaneously has heart surgery going on. And I think, unfortunately, we do often see Ukraine struggling to address several problems simultaneously while also surviving this horrible aggression with, old established networks within the elite systems also, right, that have to be updated somehow. And the system has to be reformed. But doing it simultaneously while fighting this horrible aggression is extremely challenging. And I just want to give credit for Ukraine for having really managed this, and President Zelensky also to some extent haven't managed this with success over such an extended period of time in the situation when there's no election. So it's not easy, and I would refrain from equating like reducing all problems, as some commentators have done, to corruption alone. I think the problem is much deeper. It has to do with the way the power systems are organized, that they all rely on these closed-off networks, and reforming them is extremely difficult, even in the situation of peace times and complete transparency. Not to mention, obviously, the situation Ukraine is dealing with.
Yeah, I think democracies are messy, and you tend to have opportunities for, bureaucratic turf battles to come out into the public to then elevate. And in some ways, it represents that there's difference of views, and those views get heard by then became somewhat of a crisis. But we shall see. Jade, I want to thank you so much for being here on the podcast, but we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in. Links to Jade's Substack and the article she published with Maria are available in the show notes for those who are interested. Don't forget to subscribe to our show and leave us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps. Please do that. And also be sure to check out our sister podcast, The Eurofile, wherever you get your podcasts. Also give that a 5-star rating. And we will see you next time on Russian Roulette.
You've been listening to Russian Roulette. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and tune in again soon.
Russian Roulette releases new episodes every 2 weeks and is available wherever you get your podcasts. So please subscribe to our show, share our episodes online, and give us a 5-star rating. Also, be sure to check out our sister podcast, The Eurofile, where we talk Europe through a Washington lens. This show is made possible by a grant from the Carnegie Corporation of New York.
Also, don't forget to subscribe to the CSIS channel on YouTube for live and recorded video events featuring leading experts. Finally, you can read all the latest analysis by the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies website, csis.org.